There has been a revival of Confucianism in China over the past decade. A resurgence of Confucian rituals and heightened attention paid to the protection of Confucian sites have made the Confucius legacy relevant again. How can Confucianism evolve to catch up with the times and shape future cultural discourse? Can it help solve globally concerned affairs? We talked to Stephen C. Engel, an American Confucian and professor of East Asian Studies at Wesleyan University. We have seen a revival of Confucianism in China over the past decade. So, in your opinion, why do people start revisiting Confucianism, especially with its, seemingly backward-looking feudal background?
Under the circumstances of the late Qing dynasty and the early Republic, it was easy to blame Confucianism, but the truth is that the problems were much more complicated. Mm-hmm. So I think that one part of the revival is just a remembering or rediscovery of the fact that China's traditions and China's culture is very rich, mm-hmm. and have wonderful values and resources that are relevant today in many ways. Mm-hmm. So, I think that the first part of an answer is that it's a mistake to just think of it as backwards. Mm-hmm. I think that it's true that Confucianism needs to continue to develop. We can't just rely on the Confucianism of 100 or 200 or 500 years ago, mm-hmm. because society has changed a great deal here.
China has never been so rich like today, and with the market economy booming, we are experiencing like a spiritual crisis here. So maybe we don't know what our cultural identity is. Right. Do you think it has anything to do with this, that Confucianism is a source of building a cultural identity that more matches China's status today?
It's natural for Chinese people to ask, what does it mean, right? What is the significance of all of this? Mm-hmm. As you said, many people talk about a moral crisis or a spiritual crisis where the values of the last 100 years seem not entirely satisfactory, not sufficient. Mm-hmm. Everyone's chasing money, and what does that mean? So part of it is a crisis, as you say, but I think part of it is also a desire for something, some significance, some Chinese significance in the world, and not just the fact that China has such a great economy, mm-hmm. but that there are other things that are great about China. Mm-hmm. Right? So a common slogan, a slogan these days is the idea of cultural self-confidence, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. And I think that that kind of coming to have a sort of cultural self-confidence is very important, mm-hmm. because it's about understanding, as you said, identity and values. Mm-hmm. Right? It's not the case, mm-hmm. that the only values in the world and the only identity in the world are things that come from the West. Mm-hmm. I think it's very natural that Chinese people have reached the point of wanting to say, once again, who we are, right? Mm-hmm. and what our values are.
Mm-hmm. As what you said, right. that we have to abandon those old traditional, values that's not appropriate today, that's not relevant today. And about this progressive Confucianism, right. in the aspect of culture, what do we have to progress nowadays? How to integrate those modern cultural values right. into this?
So the idea of progressive Confucianism mm-hmm. Is to recognize that a cultural tradition, a philosophical tradition, is never fixed. It's never static. Mm-hmm. It's always moving, if it is alive. So there are cultural traditions that die, and then they're just static, and you can study them the way you would study something in a museum. Mm-hmm. Right? You want to understand what it was once like. Mm-hmm. But living cultural traditions are not like that. They always have to be changing because society is always changing, the economy is always changing, you're running into new people and new ideas that...
it has to run its own course.
Exactly, exactly. So the idea of progressive Confucianism is not simply to drop old things and pick up new things, but it's rather that China's culture and the Confucian tradition needs to develop internally, develop for its own reasons. So not just because there's a value of, let's say, freedom that's emphasized in the West. And right, it's not that we just, because the West emphasizes freedom, so Confucianism has to emphasize freedom. No. Confucianism and Confucians need to look at modern China, look at the modern world, and ask, what do our values tell us to do now? How do we respond to the modern world? So probably the most important thing that Confucianism teaches is that all of us have the potential to become a sage. But to say that we should think about sagehood is not just to say that we should think about a very distant, sort of almost impossible to achieve ideal. It's really just to think that we should always be trying to be better. So we should be better tomorrow than we are today.
Better version of ourselves.
A better version of ourselves.
That's a
right.
universal value.
I think in many ways it is. That's right. But Confucianism has its own particular understanding of what the ways in which to get better, the sorts of values that are important, things like, ren and yi, right? Humaneness and righteousness, benevolence, if you like, and the ritual propriety, li, right? So these are ways in which we all need to get better. Right? So that's the core of Confucianism. I have many students, they're all very interested, and we use Confucian ideas. So this is long before I started to think about this question of being whether I was a Confucian myself. But we already were using Confucian ideas to think about our lives in the United States.
And actually China has employed a very open attitude towards Western culture, especially after the reform and opening up.
Right.
And especially with pop culture.
Right.
We watch Hollywood movies.
Right.
We celebrate Western festivals.
Right.
So what do you make of this coexistence of like traditional Confucianism values and the embrace of Western culture?
So,
do we see a collision here?
I don't see a collision, no, because I think that Confucianism has, and Chinese culture and Confucianism both have been themselves very open, right? And there are many examples of other ideas and cultures coming to China, being changed somewhat by the new... being localized by the new context, but then also contributing to the sort of central culture of Confucianism. So the best example, of course, is Buddhism.
China has never been so engaged in international affairs like today. So what impact might Confucianism ideas have on those globally concerned issues like war and conflicts, like environmental problems?
Throughout the history of Confucianism, and certainly certainly since Neo-Confucianism, have celebrated the relationship between humans and nature, right? So the idea of forming one body with all things is a wonderful ideal. And there are many ways in which going out into nature and being reminded of the life and rebirth and so on that's everywhere in nature helps Confucians really to understand the value of the cosmos. Right? There's this phrase from the I Ching, "sheng sheng bu xi," right? Sort of continuous birth and rebirth. That is very much the core of Confucianism. So all of that helps to support concern for the environment. However, historically, there are no Confucian environmentalists.
Right.
Right? There are Confucians who love the environment, but there's no Confucian environmental policy. And that's partly because the idea of environmental policy, the idea of thinking about climate change in a systematic way, in a scientific way, is a modern idea.
Right.
So I think modern science has helped us to realize what the problems are. And I think a combination of modern science and these Confucian values can really promote a kind of environmentalism that still recognizes that humans are very important, but that humans need to be in a balance with nature, in a harmony with nature.
So in what ways can Confucianism shape the future cultural discourse in China?
In terms of what the influence that Confucianism may have on Chinese culture, on modern Chinese culture, contemporary Chinese culture, I think that it can have a very positive influence, but only if it goes through this process of rethinking what it means in the modern world, right? So at the same time, there's continuity, still Confucianism, still Confucian values, still reading the Analects, still thinking about benevolence and righteousness, but as the society and technology and economics and politics all continue to develop, right, then exactly what these things tell us will change. And I think that kind of flexible, growing Confucianism will be very powerful.
Right.
A great resource for China and ultimately for the world.